Good morning, everybody. Welcome to ITIF's webinar, Active Carbon Management, Critical Tools in the Climate Toolbox. My name is David Hart, and I am the Director of the Center for Clean Energy Innovation here at ITIF. ITIF is a think tank that deals with a wide range of science and technology policy issues, and the Center for Clean Energy Innovation deals with innovation in clean energy and climate technology. We've got a tremendous lineup for you today. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to our moderator, Jeff St. John. He is the Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media and a national resource, if I may say so. If you're not reading Jeff St. John and you're in the clean energy and climate business, you are not well informed. So Jeff, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And thanks to all attending this discussion today. I was going to plug myself, but David did it for me. Thank you very much. It's very kind. Canary Media, you can find us at www.canarymedia.com, and we have a mission of chronically investigating and engaging in the transition to a decarbonized economy and society. And active carbon management is a major part of that. I'd like to thank ITIF for inviting me to moderate today's discussion, and thank our esteemed panelists for bringing their experience and insight to such an important topic. And our first panelist has quite a bit of expertise to share with us. Representative Paul D. Tonko is a 7-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing New York's 20th Congressional District, which includes the cities of Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Saratoga Springs, and his hometown of Amsterdam. Representative Tonko is a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and serves as chair of the Subcommittee on the Environment and Climate Change. He was appointed to join the Committee on Natural Resources and continues to serve on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. And he's also the former president and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, and he used to be an engineer for the New York State Public Service Commission, so I dare say he knows the energy industry well. Congressman Tonko, you've sponsored and supported a lot of energy legislation that I've covered over the years. Too long a list to probably recite here this morning. But most recently, last month, you and Representative Scott Peters of California introduced the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act of 2022. This act would establish an increasing annual federal requirement to remove carbon dioxide through direct air capture and other technological removal solutions. And so, Congressman, can you tell us about this legislation, why you believe it's needed, and what it would do to change the status quo in terms of federal support of active carbon management today?
Well, thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. And I was asked if I would please just offer some opening comments, and we'll do that. We can get into that further discussion. But I thank you for the introduction. And I do want to thank ITIF, especially David and Stefan, for hosting this great webinar, inviting me to join. Dr. Wilcox, Carbon 180, and Climeworks are certainly some of the world's leading experts in carbon management. And so it's an honor to be part of this panel. I'll try to keep my remarks brief to give more time to those real experts. But for my part, I've spent my career pushing for science-based solutions to tackle climate change. And since joining Congress in 2009, Jeff, I've seen what can happen when the federal government invests in clean energy innovation. It changes what is thought to be possible and reshapes political debates as to how we can serve as better stewards of our environment while growing our economy. And in 2009, very few people would have believed the cost reductions we've seen in wind and solar, and certainly in lithium-ion batteries. Very few people could have imagined the level of commitments that have occurred for offshore wind or the number of electric vehicle models that would be available to choose from. So these revolutions have happened because the federal government's support for clean energy entrepreneurs and innovators has become very prominent. And now we need that same commitment for the next generation of technologies, the ones that are going to help get us over the finish line to a net zero economy. So I know that there is much more to do, and we remain a long way from that finish line. But if we don't start to think about what we need for that last 10% now, those technologies won't be an option when we need them. So we need to keep pushing even harder for all of these solutions, deploying commercially available mitigation measures today as boldly and quickly as possible, and investing in other innovations that have a longer time horizon. And I think this is aligned with the most recent IPCC climate mitigation report, which laid out the tools we have to address in fighting the climate crisis. It shows us that we have the technical tools to economically reach a pathway that limits global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as the IPCC also laid out, while our largest focus should stay on mitigation, carbon management solutions like carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, are an essential part of a realistic pathway to a sustainable planet. So CDR is the only way for us to address our historical emissions. And I believe it's our responsibility to invest in removing those emissions to reduce our impact on our global neighbors. We're also going to need some way to account for those hard to decarbonize emitters to achieve our net zero goals, and CDR can help with that also. Again, this isn't an excuse to continue emitting. I don't think anyone thinks that CDR, even under the best case scenario for cost reductions, will be able to balance a net zero economy if we don't make major cuts to emissions. A lot of the technologies that do this removal work are very promising, but they are also new and expensive. They need to scale massively to have this necessary impact. To make that scale up happen, the CDR market needs certainty. And so private commitments have stepped up amazingly. But in the end, carbon removal will need federal policy intervention to scale to where it needs to be. So I believe deploying these technologies will be a public good. We'll need them, but it isn't certain there will be enough customers to justify operating them at scale and at very high costs. But the federal government can play a huge role in investing today to lower those costs, helping to ensure that these technologies can perform when we'll really need them in the 2030s and 2040s and beyond. At the same time, as with any new energy technology, we certainly need to make certain that industry scales responsibly and that it does not replicate the harms of the fossil fuel system. For those reasons, Congressman Scott Peters and I did introduce the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act that you referenced. This bill was put together with the help of dozens of incredible stakeholders, including Carbon 180 and Climeworks. It requires the Department of Energy to invest in CDR. It ensures best practices for monitoring, for reporting, and for verification of removals, and prioritizes domestic jobs, environmental justice, and certainly innovative technologies. So the bill does this by requiring DOE to pay for the removal of a specific number of tons each year. And over time, the number of tons goes up, and the maximum price DOE can pay goes down. This is intended to send a signal to these innovative companies and investors that if you build CDR solutions, there will be an off-taker for your services. This is the type of guaranteed demand that can help jumpstart the industry by providing long-term certainty at significant scale. And this isn't completely out of left field. DOE already has a long-standing requirement about purchasing a certain percentage of its electricity from renewables. This department is great at fostering innovation, and I believe this is just one approach that could be effective. But it's not the only option, and I look forward to continued conversations about what's the right role for the federal government in carbon removal. And in fact, this isn't even the only exciting effort on carbon management going on at the federal level right now. I was proud to support the bipartisan infrastructure law, which contains within it significant funding for direct air capture hubs. And I know there's also work going on to support point source carbon capture R&D and demonstrations, which will likely be necessary for many of those hard to decarbonize, if you will, industrial applications. I'm indeed excited to hear from Dr. Wilcox about the Department of Energy's work as it prepares to implement the DAC hubs and the other carbon management funding from the IIJA. From my perspective, carbon management has proven to be a great opportunity for collaboration across the aisle in Congress. And I do hope that the bipartisan conversations on these topics truly continues. Most importantly, as I've worked on these issues, I have deeply appreciated the value of expertise to guide our policy decisions. I want to offer a heartfelt thank you to all those experts that have contributed and continue to contribute their deep knowledge to help us make informed, science-based climate policy possible. The ITIF report is just the latest example of this, laying out the needs and federal funding situation and making some great recommendations as to what policymakers and advocates could do next to promote active carbon management in the U.S. And as we all know, the cost of climate inaction is high. And for our future generations, for our most vulnerable communities, and for all humanity. So carbon management can be an important role in our fight to decarbonize. And I thank you all so much for this webinar. Thank you for the time that you're investing in this issue. And I look forward to a good discussion as we go forward with these efforts.
Great. Thank you, Representative Tonko. And I'm sure we all have a lot of questions about how
Sure.
the market-making role that you envision for the DOE might kind of complement the R&D and deployment funding that's coming from DOE. I do want to remind our audience that the viewers can put questions into the Slido box below the broadcast here, and we'll be taking those questions and bringing them to our panelists. Representative Tonko, I don't know if I can ask you if you and other research folks who are working on this bill have identified how much money the federal government needs to make available to serve that critical off-taker role for these technologies, and how that can appropriately be scaled over time to match the development of technologies, the reduction in cost, and all those complicated issues that we think about when we think about how the federal government makes markets for things that don't yet exist.
Yeah, well, it will take the assistance of DOE to help us calculate that number. And we'll also work closely with, certainly with the budget folks in the House. And bills get scored routinely. So we'll be going through that process. But I think establishing a priority and a structure that of that priority is the start in the process, so that as we develop this legislation, all of that calculus will come to be, and we'll rely on the experts to help us mold that number that will be an essential number. We have got to find a way to make that work within the budget process.
I think I'm also curious to ask you about how you see the kind of what you think are the most important things to keep in mind when you think about the role that DOE will be playing in assessing these and setting these best practices for monitoring, reporting, and verifying carbon removal. What issues do you and your constituents focus on when they think about what we need to be measuring, what we need to be verifying?
Well, I think that basically, I think the public information here has got to emphasize the fact that we're not using this as a way to absolve ourselves of any responsibility for, the climate issue, making certain that we continue to remove those greenhouse gases and decarbonize our economy continues to be the highest priority. But what I think we're going to have to do as a legislative body, certainly as government, working with DOE as an agency, is to continue the discussion of this being an added tool that will enable us to increase the amount of carbon dioxide emission removal that will, start with that effort so that we eventually reach 10 million tons per year by the mid-2030s. I think that will be an important threshold to achieve, and to make certain that we find that appropriate price, so that we begin with that price that will be addressing the per ton price ceiling that will obviously incentivize cost reductions over time, but starting that at perhaps $5.50 per ton and declining to $150 per ton in the mid-2030s will hopefully be the tools that guide us in this process.
Interesting. We do have a quick question from the audience regarding the 45Q tax credits. The question is, how can 45Q be further modified to include smaller companies with exciting new technologies, or how can it be modified in other ways that you think are important?
Well, I think, as we develop these technologies, which is also a goal for the department, that it will enable them to look at any of the development through their research activities, monitor those technologies, and then constantly address the tax codification, tax policy as we go along. But I fully envision these technologies being incorporated in the tax incentiving packages that we're going to do, because we have rather robust goals for decarbonization, and we're going to have to utilize every bit of strategy in policy format that gets us to where we need to be.
I do need to ask about the current political prospects of this particular piece of legislation, whether as a standalone bill or as part of a broader energy package. Things have been difficult on that front. Can you give us any insight into what's going to happen the rest of this session?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that from what I'm sensing, there's bipartisan interest in this concept of CDR. That's encouraging. I think we'll continue to gain support as we go forward. I think people are more and more recognizing that there is a climate crisis at hand, and that whether they have tried to delay or deny, more and more Mother Nature is speaking more boldly, and it's gone into a backyard scenario for many colleagues. And so they're opening up to various technologies and approaches. And that I think from the outset, CDR looks to have more bipartisan support than some other approaches. So I'm encouraged by that, Jeff.
And I wonder if you've heard from your constituents about concerns that the support for CDR may be tied to desires to allow fossil fuel industries to offset their carbon emissions, and how you explain to folks how you differentiate between carbon capture and storage that helps versus excuses.
I hear you. And that is a concern going into this, but we have to make it abundantly clear that the aggressive, bold goals that we have are going to be maintained. We're going to keep the stewardship that is essential from all the players in the process. They can't continue to contribute to the carbon emission equation. This is about the past sins. It's about dealing with a lot of the again, the nature, the absolute desire, urgency, I should say, of decarbonizing our atmosphere. And we can't simply allow for further relaxation of any of the rules and regs. We're going to stay on that course, and this will be a tool to assist in cleaning up what's happened in the past. So there will be a strict demarcation here to make certain that the agency efforts, the federal government efforts will be maintained, and this will just be a way to just further assist us with some of the carbon that exists out there.
Thank you. Really interesting. Really looking forward to tracking the progress of this and related legislation. Representative Tonko, I do think I would like to bring our next panelist into the conversation, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Dr. Jennifer Wilcox is a noted expert on carbon capture. In fact, she wrote the book on it. Dr. Wilcox is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. That carbon management part is a recent addition to the office's title, I should note. Dr. Wilcox has done extensive research on the nexus of energy and the environment, with work on both mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize the negative climate impacts associated with society's dependence on fossil fuels. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering, an MA in chemistry from University of Arizona, and an MA in mathematics from Wellesley College. She serves on committees of the National Academies of Science and the American Physical Society to assess carbon capture methods and impacts on climate. And as mentioned, she is the author of the first textbook on carbon capture, titled Carbon Capture, and published in 2012. And she co-edited the CDR Primer on carbon dioxide removal in 2021. And Dr. Wilcox, we know that DOE has a lot of work underway on carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, direct air capture. The bipartisan infrastructure law passed last year contains about $12.5 billion for carbon capture and demo and pilot projects, direct air capture, carbon removal hub projects, carbon dioxide transport projects, and storage validation and testing. And the overall goal of DOE under its carbon negative shot initiative is a carbon removal cost of $100 per ton and I think 1 billion tons of emissions sequestered by 2050. We're quite eager to hear about how DOE is working on making all this happen and how you are working with other experts there to guide these projects and programs on getting there. So look forward to hearing more.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. I did have a few slides that I wanted to share, and I think they're coming up now. Yep. So, and we can just go to the next slide. So in this next slide, I want to give you a little bit of insight into what we've been up to for this past year. So there's a number of climate goals that we've set out in this administration, which you're probably all well aware of, but 50% emissions reduction by 2030, which is less than a decade away, clean electricity by 2035, and then ultimately net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And as you also mentioned, we changed the name of our office. It was formerly the Office of Fossil Energy. We added 2 very important words, carbon management, back on July 4th. And we also spent the last year reorganizing the Office of Fossil Energy and carbon management more significantly since its inception in 1977. Next slide. And alongside our reorganization, we released a strategic vision document, which just was released just a few weeks ago. So if anybody's interested in more of a deep dive, we have a number of areas that we're focusing on, but they can kind of be bucketed into these 3 categories. First, of course, carbon management is a big piece. As we use fossil fuels today for energy generation, for all sorts of different sectors, we have to be able to develop strategies to decarbonize these sectors and just avoid their emissions in the first place from entering the atmosphere. And then also, as Representative Tonko mentioned, a critical tool to achieving net zero for residual emissions and hard to avoid sectors, we're going to need to take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. And so all of these pieces really fall into the category of managing carbon. The next piece is really about how we are still dependent on fossil fuels today, and not just in the United States, but globally, and recognizing that as we extract fossil fuels out of the earth, that there are also there's energy that it takes to do that. And there's also a lot of times methane leakage or methane emissions associated with these supply chains of fossil fuels. And so we're focusing too on quantifying methane emissions associated with production of fossil fuels and then mitigating methane to the best that we can do. And then finally, through everything that we're doing is recognizing that we are an office that invests in R&D, and that ultimately that R&D is going to lead to demonstration, and ultimately demonstration leads to deployment. And we recognize that we're putting technologies into the communities, and we need to be able to understand the impacts that these technologies have on communities, be able to understand legacy impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels, and how we can invest in strategies that can actually lead to benefits to communities. So community engagement is a huge piece of the administration's agenda. And then also making sure that we recognize the workforce alignments as we look at transitioning. Next slide. Very briefly, when I started over a year ago as a political appointee in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, just looking at the investments that our office was making across natural gas, oil, and coal, and being able to understand how can we invest our approaches so that we're actually investing in minimizing environmental and climate impacts associated with our dependence. And in order to figure that out, you have to understand how complicated these sectors are and in what ways we are dependent upon them today. I would say natural gas goes down as one of the more complex, because you can see in the bar chart, it's the top bar is associated with our energy consumption, including net exports. And the bottom is the greenhouse gases associated with each of the sectors. So we use natural gas for heat, both commercial, residential. And as we know, when we do that, it's distributed very hard to decarbonize, especially with locked-in technologies today. We also use it for power generation. So from the FECM perspective, we're looking at committed emissions that are expected to persist through mid-century, not power plants that are expected to, say, retire over the next decade, but really looking at advancing to demonstration on CCS at point sources associated with committed emissions. When we look at oil, our office doesn't do a lot in terms of refining, but one thing that we are focusing on is, can we make synthetic fuels using CO2 as a chemical feedstock combined with clean hydrogen in order to offset our dependence on conventional production of liquid fuels and refined fuels. And then finally, in terms of coal, our dependence is primarily in the United States on power generation. But in this sector, you do have to be careful in looking at whether or not a unit is going to retire, or is it truly going to persist through mid-century. If it's going to persist through mid-century, then those are committed emissions that we should always decarbonize first and foremost, rather than having to pull the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Next slide. Again, if you want to look into the strategic vision, these are the different areas, but I urge you to just do a search and download it and take a look. But really just 7 critical areas where we're looking at carbon management, and then also how we recover resources from the earth and how we can make these processes sustainable as possible. Next slide. This is something that I always present to, because I'm a teacher at heart. I'm on leave as a professor right now of chemical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. And so here what we're showing is recognition that as you get more dilute streams of CO2, on the right-hand side, we have a stream where we're looking at the production of hydrogen using natural gas as a feedstock, which is pretty concentrated in CO2 compared to, as we get more dilute, a cement or an exhaust stream from a steel production facility. And then finally, very dilute, when you look at CO2 from a natural gas-fired power plant, can be 3 to 5% concentration, but then still 100 times more concentrated than CO2 in the atmosphere today, which is roughly 415 parts per million. So as we are advancing technologies to avoid and mitigate CO2 from entering the atmosphere, we should never see methods like carbon removal and direct air capture as a means to offset emissions that we actually have technologies to avoid. Next slide. And so this is a kind of a vision that gives you a responsible way to be thinking about carbon dioxide removal. And Jeff, you mentioned, I helped to spearhead an effort called the CDR Primer, which is an open access document that we released last year. I think there's going to be hard copies available later this summer. And this is really just meant to be a primer associated with carbon dioxide removal. And one of the first, stories in the primer is that we need to be thinking about this in a very responsible way. And we need to be thinking about calculations from a bottom-up perspective. CDR should really be there as a net zero tool for residual emissions. If you look at CCS at a power plant, maybe you can only do capture at 95%, but what about that additional 5% that needs to also be, avoided? When you look at cement or steel production, hard to decarbonize sectors with renewables today. And so agricultural, shipping, and aviation, all of these are truly hard to decarbonize sectors. When you add them all up in the US anyway, they add to about a gigaton, which would mean that the CDR should at least be scaled to a gigaton in order to offset truly hard to decarbonize sectors, which is our focus. But you've got to do this regional calculation in order to figure out how much CDR is going to be required to get to net zero. Next slide. Also, in November, we launched the carbon negative shot. So this is a third of a series of energy earth shots that the DOE is investing in. The idea here is that we are including all CDR approaches, everything in the portfolio. There's no silver bullet even when it comes to CDR. But here's the key. The question is that what is the actual robust carbon removal for a nature-based approach versus a technological-based approach like direct air capture? We need to be able to have carbon accounting across all of these sectors. And as a Representative Tonko pointed out, the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification, all of these metrics need to be properly defined for each of these approaches. And so through the carbon negative shot, this is a huge initiative that we're hoping to do so that we can actually show carbon removal in a robust and durable way. and have the metrics that we need to quantify across each of the broad portfolio approaches. We're going to be investing across DOE, not just FECM, but EERE and the other applied offices through annual appropriations to really move middle TRL up to the higher technological readiness level so that we're actually ready to do the demonstration work. Hoping that over the next 5 to 10 years, as we invest, we'll go from thousands of tons of removal today to millions of tons of removal, and hopefully learn by doing and get down that cost curve to getting to $100 per ton. Next slide. So briefly, I just want to talk about the infrastructure law funding. So within the fossil energy and carbon management, looking at equities of about $6.5 billion associated with carbon management over the next 5 years through the infrastructure law. In terms of carbon removal, really $3.5 billion associated with direct air capture. But we can also notice that direct air capture, you can use chemicals, you can use waste or sustainably sourced biomass as a feedstock, and even minerals. So there's lots of ways to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere. Also carbon dioxide conversion and reliable storage. In this program, we're hoping to build out the infrastructure and build out the capacity for CO2 storage, hoping to achieve 60 million tons of CO2 injection per year over the next 5 to 10 years. And so that when you're looking at a carbon capture project, there's somewhere to put the CO2. So the government is investing in developing the capacity to actually store the CO2 in a robust and durable and a dedicated way. In addition to a couple of other provisions associated with critical minerals, domestic supply chains, and then also front-end engineering design studies, mostly associated with transport. Next slide. And this is my last bit. If you haven't heard, the Department of Energy has also just broadly gone through its own realignment. So not just our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, but broadly DOE, in order to really be able to spend in a thoughtful and meaningful ways the $62 billion that's coming into DOE from the infrastructure law. And so in that alignment, they've developed a Undersecretary's Office S3 for infrastructure. And so this is really important. So previously, we had an undersecretary specifically focused on innovation and science and technology, but now it's also, we have a second undersecretary where we're going to actually see some of these deployment dollars going out in a thoughtful way through an Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And so for the large carbon capture demonstrations and pilots, this is where that funding is going through. And these are actually two coupled to storage, so separate from the storage provisions that I just mentioned. And the hydrogen hubs funding and the CO2 transport funding is also going through the Office of Clean Energy Demos under the Undersecretary for Infrastructure. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Really interesting. We do have a number of questions and probably not enough time to get to all of them, but we did want to ask, DOE is leading the way. This is from the audience. DOE is leading the way on carbon management. How is the department thinking about repurposing waste carbon feedstocks to create sustainable products? And I guess I would add, to what extent is, how far can that get us in terms of improving the economics of this process?
So, yeah, sure. So in terms of waste carbon, I mean, there's work we're doing. We have a division on hydrogen coupled to carbon management. And so here we're looking at advanced gasification processes. And so what that means is you can use flexible feedstocks. So flexible feedstocks meaning waste plastic. You can use stockpiled waste coal tailings from coal mining that have been stockpiled and are really residuals. You can also use waste biomass. And you can feed all of these into a gasification process to produce hydrogen, typically also co-produces carbon dioxide. But if you capture the CO2 and you store it in a dedicated and reliable way, and if that feedstock is coming from, say, waste biomass, that could even produce a negative stream of hydrogen in terms of a carbon intensity. But this is a whole division that we're focused on, which is really advanced gasification for clean hydrogen production in FECM.
Gotcha. I know we don't have too much time more with you. I did want to ask one last question from the audience. If you can speak more about CDR CCUS carbon management, and how it could support a just transition of fossil fuel workforce and expertise and capital to a net zero economy. I'm wondering how the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations is managing that particular priority or optimization strategy.
Sure. So from the perspective of a just transition, but first, in terms of some of the justice perspectives, they don't always overlap with workforce. And so first, I'll just talk about the workforce piece, which, you can kind of think of it even as part of the story, but not the whole story. It's not just about jobs. But in terms of jobs, one of the things that we're seeing is as we look at increasing our efforts in injection of CO2 deep underground, essentially that's going to mean more wells, and it's going to be the same workforce that produces oil and gas today. That same workforce will be the ones who are going to be reversing the flow of carbon back into the earth. So there's a lot of parallels associated with the production of oil and gas today and the re-injection really of that carbon. And we're looking at a lot of opportunities where can we leverage capital investments associated with oil and gas in terms of wells or in terms of just some of that technical expertise and repurpose it for CO2 sequestration. And so that's an active area. The other piece associated with that is in that industry, enhanced oil recovery has been taking place in the United States for over 3 decades. That's the largest utilization for CO2 today. And a lot of that CO2, in fact, most of it is naturally sourced from domes, so naturally sourced from CO2 in the earth. Is there a way that we can repurpose those domes that have been producing CO2 for that industry and store it back into those domes, repressurize the domes with CO2 since they were born to store it to begin with? And so this is another area that we're trying to think about, and that would really represent a shift in that industry to shift away from naturally sourced CO2 for EOR. In terms of justice, and this is different from my perspective, this is about as we look at oil and gas production and we look at those same communities that may have to, understand what are the risks associated with CO2 sequestration, because we can imagine you're injecting them into depleted oil and gas reservoirs. We need to first understand what the impacts have been in terms of fossil production on communities, what their concerns are, and then be really transparent about what the risks are with CO2 sequestration, the groundwater potential risks, the induced seismicity risks, and then be very transparent and clear that we actually have spent 2 decades or more developing the tools to mitigate the risks, to monitor the CO2 plume, to prevent groundwater contamination, and that we know how to do it, and that we know how to put CO2 in the ground in a safe and reliable way. But the key is transparency. Transparency about what the risks are, transparency about what the tools are to monitor and mitigate the risks at the best we can do. And so that's a lot of the effort that we're looking into.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. And
Sure.
thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to Representative Tonko as well for taking the time. I'm sure you'll be getting a lot of inquiries asking for more information.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And now I'd like to turn things over to Stefan Koster, Senior Policy Analyst at ITIF, who's here to review the latest research from ITIF on active carbon management.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Wilcox and Representative Tonko, for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us. We really appreciate it. My name is Stefan Koster. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst here at the ITIF Center for Clean Energy Innovation. Thank you all for joining us. And what I hope today, I'm going to just give a very brief, because I want to get into the panelists that we have, overview of the report that ITIF just published alongside by myself and David Hart. It's what I hope everyone who's listening today takes away from is that these technologies, what we've dubbed active carbon management, will be essentially vitally necessary to tackling climate change. And we have to use the next decade to perfect these technologies, to lower the regulatory hurdles and spur large-scale deployment of projects in the United States and around the world. And I think DOE, the efforts of Dr. Wilcox, as well as efforts by Representative Tonko, are essential to making that happen. That's just a little bit about ITIF itself. I'll move on. I think we're all familiar, obviously, with the science of climate change, so I won't delve in too much there. But we know that as long as we have, as life on Earth has been around, there's been a way of naturally managing carbon through the carbon cycle. And that's essentially been through biomass or chemically through geology or oceans and so forth. However, we know now that we must reduce those emissions that are going up into the air, and we also must pool emitted CO2 from the atmosphere at a very rapid rate between now, 2050, and 2100. Natural carbon sequestration has done the mass majority of global carbon of sequestration work. Again, this is through photosynthesis, geologic weathering, and soil carbon uptake. However, these solutions are unlikely to be the primary means by which we reduce global emissions in the fastest way possible. Namely, in a climate-changing world, we have concerns regarding the permanency, the transparency, and sometimes the huge land use requirements for many of these natural carbon solutions. While we think preserving and growing natural carbon sinks is absolutely critical for a whole host of reasons beyond just reducing emissions, we don't think that essentially we'll be able to plant enough trees in time to really tackle global runaway emissions. Thankfully, we have these long pioneered technologies to sequester carbon, both from the smokestack and through ambient air. And Dr. Wilcox gave a great overview and presentation of sort of the benefits and challenges of that. Carbon capture from the smokestack can occur both, again, at the power plant level, or from, say, an ethanol fermenter, or even an industrial site that produces blue hydrogen or cement even. The major requirements, briefly, for CCS are heat and electricity, water, and some kind of regenerative CO2 absorber. After that, it's captured. The CO2 can be cleaned and piped and shipped to an industrial site, such as an EOR facility or somewhere where the carbon can be used in products, or it can be stored permanently in deep underground storage, as Dr. Wilcox noted there at the end. Direct air capture, or DAC, relies on similar technology, but pools CO2 from the ambient air. And again, CO2 in the ambient air, while it's going up, it still represents only 0.04% of air. So what that means is that you need these large arrays of industrial fans alongside CO2 absorbents and heat and electricity to capture and sequester that ambient CO2. Today, there's over about 100 CCS plants operating around the world, and they capture around 40 million tons annually, with most of that CO2 being used, again, in enhanced oil recovery. There's one demonstration scale DAC facility, and we're very lucky to have Peter Freudenstein today from the company that built and operates that plant, Climeworks. So I'll leave it to him to speak on that. But there are also other exciting startups and sort of late startup firms that are in this space that are attracting a lot of significant financial interests, as well as philanthropic investment. Regarding cost per ton, just briefly, I think it's very hard, and if you talk to anyone in this space, to really generalize. But today we're seeing estimates for CCS that range from about as low as $30 a ton on a high CO2 concentration stream, like an ethanol fermenter, to about $150 to $200 for more complex operations. And DAC is estimated about $200 to $500 per ton. But we're hoping to see those numbers really come down in line with the DOE's Earthshot of about $100 a ton. I just wanted to introduce this typology that we developed. I won't run through it all, but essentially what we decided is, or we saw in the research, is there's a lot of terminology out there, and we wanted to keep it nice and we didn't want to add to the confusion, but hopefully we wanted to obviously clarify. So on the left here, you'll see what we dubbed natural carbon management. I think planting forests, soil uptake, biochar, afforestation, etc. In the right side, we've got active carbon management, CCS, direct air capture, some of the subsequent uses of that potential carbon. And in the middle there, we've got essentially hybrid approaches like bioenergy capture and storage, which uses the natural benefits of photosynthesis with trees and biomass and other things, and then applies sort of an active engineered-based sequestration process. The global need for CCS and DAC is immense. I think we're all familiar with the recent IPCC report, and we're probably scared and alarmed by it. In that they really noted the huge increase that we're going to need in carbon capture potential. They estimate that we'll need as much as 350 gigatons of CO2 removal by 2100. Just for reference, in 2019, global emissions were north of 40 gigatons a year, and the US emitted about 15% of that. So to reach those really ambitious levels, we're going to need to scale these technologies at an incredible pace and incredible time constraints. However, the industry also represents, and Dr. Wilcox talked on this as well, and so did Representative Tonko, a tremendous opportunity for a new industrial sector. Deloitte, for example, in 2020 estimated that this could be a $2 to $5 trillion global industry by 2100. Global GDP is, somewhere around $100 trillion, so it's immense. In terms of technology development, I think the United States and Europe are certainly leaders, both from the firm level as well as the government-led RD&D. However, we should note, China and India are quickly catching up into this area. Particularly, China is interested in applications for CCS and direct air capture, particularly CCS on industrial sites, so that they can continue to that development, and also use their natural resources while managing carbon. So we've identified just a few. I don't want to run through all of these, but in our discussions with people in the research for this paper, everyone we spoke to and who works in this space said that 45Q federal tax credits are essential, but they fear that without increasing those to a sustainable and higher level, that it's going to be impossible to really de-risk some of these projects to the degree that attracts that private sector funding. Additionally, providing means for the private sector to fund projects and carbon off-takers is critical. If you follow this space closely, a couple of weeks ago, there was a really exciting announcement by Stripe, which is a global payment system for what they call an advanced market commitment. It's previously been used in vaccine development, and they've announced over close to $1 billion. And we think that's sort of an excellent example of these new and innovative ways to fund these projects. Again, it's too much to detail here, but there's some permitting and siting concerns at the federal level and state level as well that we think need to be addressed if we're going to really build out the 65,000 miles of CO2 pipelines that we need. Today, it takes about 6 years to site, permit, and build these pipelines. Obviously, if we're going to do that at the scale we need to do that faster. And finally, we noted the need for transparent and comparable standards for captured carbon. For example, we need to ensure that folks are confident that 1 ton of carbon captured via one technology, whether that's Climeworks technology or some other technology, is equivalent to a ton of carbon captured in another technological process. As well, we want to ensure that carbon is staying sequestered either underground or in the products, such as a cement or whatever synthetic carbon materials we might rely on. I want to conclude with just some brief thoughts on how we see the U.S. and the world achieving, what's been dubbed elsewhere the sort of gigaton challenge. The IIJA funding that Dr. Wilcox noted earlier is vitally essential, and it includes some really innovative features like hubs and technology prizes. Continued RD&D is certainly a space where we need this, and DOE will be essential. We need to reduce the energy penalty, essentially, for CCS and direct air capture by improving the absorbance that we use and rely on while reducing energy and water demands. Eventually, we think that we're going to need to establish some kind of federally funded cleanup fund to really make this work financially. I think the analogy between carbon cleanup and waste and sewer management is not perfect, but we see a future where governments will have to provide some form of direct pay options to private companies for removal in order to reach that scale. Finally, and I hope this is something we get into with Carbon 180 and Climeworks in our panel, we hope we're going to need to improve on the engagement with communities that are most likely to be affected by the large build out of carbon management. For example, in the Southeast and along the Gulf Coast, areas that are already heavily industrialized. I think we really need to encourage environmental justice community. We need to engage with environmental justice communities early in the process. We can't make them shoulder the entirety of the burden. And I think most importantly, we need to develop public policies at the federal and state level that really share the benefits and risks and costs among all people and all communities equally. So I want to just wrap up. There's just a link to the report if you want to check it out, as well as the infographic. Please feel free to use and share that as well. And I'm really excited to get into the panel. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Stefan. And I'd like to welcome our panelists to this discussion. Peter Freudenstein is Climate Policy Manager at Climeworks, a leading direct air capture company. He covers carbon dioxide removal policy developments in the U.S. and Europe. As Stefan mentioned, Climeworks is the Swiss direct air capture company that launched the world's largest direct air capture storage plant in Iceland last fall. just secured a $650 million funding round and is actively looking toward a large-scale deployment in the U.S. Customers include Microsoft, Swiss Re, and Stripe, one of the many companies that launched that $1 billion fund Stefan mentioned. And second, we have Anu Khan, who is Deputy Director of Science and Innovation at Carbon 180, a U.S.-based non-governmental organization that works closely with policymakers, entrepreneurs, scientists, peer organizations on equitable and science-based policies that bring carbon removal solutions to gigaton scale. Anu works to ensure that Carbon 180's policy development and advocacy is based on best available research, and her previous experience includes climate philanthropy at Founders Pledge and material science research for high-temperature energy technology applications at Northwestern University and the California Institute of Technology. So both of you are well-versed in the policy and technology challenges that we face. I don't want to rehash the scope and scale of the challenge that Stefan laid out. I guess I would love to open the floor to both of you to tell us, how do we get started on tackling this enormous challenge, and where do you all see the most important initial policy and technology efforts before us right now? Peter, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'll start off, and thank you so much for hosting us. Thanks to the comments by Representative Tonko and Dr. Wilcox. Appreciate your work a lot, and hopefully a fruitful cooperation to the future as well. I guess like the big overall tagline, I guess, is always deployment by innovation. I think this is something that's been said over and over again. I think we're really at this point where certain technologies, including Climeworks, I think is at a stage where we're ready for large-scale deployment. I think where we are at the stage where we can showcase that our direct capture works at a large scale as well. I think there will be a lot of important learnings that will come out of a large-scale deployment. And I think now this decade is actually the time for us to do it, for us to bring in those learnings. I think for agencies like the DOE, to learn how to manage such projects, and obviously also then for the wider market, also to figure out how to deal with direct air capture, how to integrate direct air capture into the wider system. I think like very specifically, what else do we need? I think it's been repeated many times already. 45Q, as mentioned earlier, I think is one of the key priorities that we as a direct air capture developer have, and that we would like to see enhanced. I think that the current version is certainly helpful and has been an important signal for the market, but certainly this is currently, I think, too low, at least for us, to really de-risk a larger number of projects. I think what is also very much needed, and I think that this is echoing what Stefan and what ITIF has mentioned, and many others I think have also said, is that the bipartisan infrastructure law programs, they need to be implemented, and they need to be implemented in a very smart and effective, and I think in a systems thinking kind of way. I will recommend that people do maybe follow up and read up on a recent report that Carbon 180, Anu's organization, just put out a couple of days ago, that has some very specific recommendations around how direct air capture hubs should be implemented. I think there's a lot of like important learnings that people can find in that report. Another thing, obviously, as a developer, we are seeing that permitting is complicated, and I'll say, we as Climeworks, we are a Swiss company. Most of our projects that we've built so far are in Europe, but we are obviously now looking for global partnerships. We're looking globally for new projects and for new project sites, and NGS for a variety of reasons. This is very interesting for us, but we do also see that to actually put steel into the ground responsibly is not the easiest thing to do in the US, especially on the permitting side. But I do think there's some very positive signs coming out, I think, both from agencies, but also from politicians. I think just recently, I think there were discussions around like how to improve like the NEPA process, I think, which I think would be very welcome from our side. And then I think two final points I think that are also important if we talk more about mid to long term. Carbon accounting. I was very happy to hear that the FECM office is working hard on this issue. I think this is something that we do need. We need transparency on the amount of carbon that is, in the end actually sequestered and that we want to take credit for, obviously. And also was very happy to see, obviously, the representative Tonko join this panel. I think we do need to think about mid to long-term policy framework around CDR as a public good, and something like a procurement scheme at the federal or maybe also state level is something that we'd certainly be happy to see introduced, at least discussed in more detail. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Anu, tell us more about the report that you all just put out and the recommendations you have, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I highly recommend checking that out. The report is called Setting DAC on Track and describes in detail our recommendations for DAC Hub implementation. And before I dive into the specifics of that report, I want to just take a step back and address this broader question of, what does DAC and CDR need to scale? We come to this from the perspective that climate change is fundamentally unjust, and we need removals, not just for what's going to happen in the future and projections of future emissions, but to address the 2 centuries of emissions that have already happened and the harm that is already caused. And so we need community participation in order for this to happen in a way that is equitable and just, but we also need really strong innovation policy. And so we're addressing this in a number of ways. I can speak to our 45Q recommendations, but also our DAC Hub's recommendations. But really what we're talking about is, how do we take removals that are today at the maybe 10 to 20,000 ton scale and bring it up to gigaton scale? And I think there's sort of 4 big challenges that we can think about addressing as we think about this scale up. And all of these are sort of localized in DAC Hub's implementation. First, infrastructure. DAC is going to require a lot of stuff to support it. It's not just kind of something that you plop in place. And so this is things like CO2 transport, geologic storage. How do we get from CO2 that's in the air to CO2 that is permanently or durably sequestered, either in a geologic reservoir or in a durable product? Another really big piece of this is going to be energy. If you just think about from a purely thermodynamic perspective, taking something that is extremely diffused in the atmosphere and bringing it down to a concentrated form, that just takes energy. And so how do we ensure that developers have access to 24/7 clean energy? That's also going to have a huge impact on the net removals from a DAC deployment. And we have some recommendations around that in DAC Hub's implementation as well. Another big thing is, of course, has been mentioned a number of times, measurement, reporting, and verification is going to be really important. Of course, the tools for measurement, also what happens to the data that's collected, how is it made available for transparency reasons, but also as a need for modeling to reduce the need for expensive physical sampling. So how do we use the data we collect from MRV? And also, as has been mentioned a number of times today, regulation and standards. So how do we set really high standards to ensure, as Stefan mentioned, that the carbon that's removed from one technology is equivalent to a ton of carbon removed by a different technology. Fourth thing that I would add, and again, this is something that we've mentioned throughout our conversation today, is risk and liability. So we're thinking of putting carbon in the ground for hundreds of years, and that's not really something that's been done. And there are models, for example, from hazardous waste or waste more generally, but really who is responsible for this when it's in the ground. And last, of course, want to come back to the point of community engagement. So as we're building out these deployments, how do we bring a more diverse group of stakeholders to the table, not just, this is a community that's going to be hosting, but as part of the overall development process from beginning to end. And I want to highlight that the report does have a section on community engagement and really thinking about how to do this from the earliest stages of deployment to a full-scale project. And one last thing I want to mention is throughout this, we're still in the very early days of DAC and CDR deployment in general. And so from our perspective, we think it's really important to keep CDR innovation policy tech agnostic, to create space for new technologies to emerge and to compete in this really nascent sector. And so again, you can see that in how we think we can implement and update 45Q in the DAC Hubs program, and also it was great to have Representative Tonko here. There are measures built into the federal CDR Leadership Act that also really take this tech neutral approach to CDR scale out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anu. Wow, a lot to cover, a lot to coordinate. I guess, I don't know if it might be a good idea to ask you, Peter, a little bit about how Climeworks project in Switzerland, I'm sorry, in Iceland is kind of aligning all these different pieces that need to be aligned, from permitting to exploring how the project that is being developed could be used to model out how the entire kind of scope of infrastructure that we're going to need for scaling this up can be built together. Very curious about what experiences you all are having on the ground out there.
Right. I mean, it's a big question, and I'll say up front that Iceland is certainly like a very unique location, where we do have like immediate access to geothermal energy, which probably one of the cleanest energy sources out there. We do have like a very great local partner in the form of Carbfix that has like a scientific way of how to like store CO2, and that has already gone through all the permitting steps that is in line with EU CCS directive regulation. So in that sense, I think there's some let's say learnings that we can take from it outside of just pure project development. I'd say I think one thing that was very exciting for us to see sort of when we actually engage with communities on the site. Again, Iceland is somewhat different in that they had lots of experience with geothermal power previously, but still, I think a lot of the project developers there had to engage with communities on site, had to be very transparent about the seismic risks, for example, that geothermal power could induce. And the project developers there had to like showcase very clearly what kind of monitoring tools that we're using, what mitigation efforts that we're undertaking. And I think we, as someone who joined in or who came to Iceland, let's say like after a lot of this conversation was already done, I think benefited a lot from it. And I think that just showcases that stakeholder engagement is super important and will take its time. And I think therefore it's good to see that DOE is very early on already pushing for developers, I think, to introduce very stringent engagement, let's say, efforts. But I think there's certainly also a role for the government as such to also take on a bigger role to educate disadvantages, possible disadvantaged communities or local communities that might be impacted. Separately, I will say again, I think what has been helpful, I think, in Iceland, and Iceland is one of the harshest conditions ever to actually build a plant. The winters are not nice, and I think this is something, and as I said earlier, it's about innovation by deployment. You actually need to build plans to actually make a learning. I think a lot of times everyone has their nice models, and then you can picture on a nice paper how your project going to look like, but you need to have or need to make real life experience for them to be able to scale up at a commercial scale. And I think this is how we have benefited largely. I'd say a lot from the Iceland project.
Wonderful. We do have a question from the audience regarding technology neutral approaches. I'd like to split it up into two parts. Stefan, did ITIF consider a technology neutral 45Q recommendation? If so, what was the conclusion? And then for the panel at large, I guess I'm very curious, how do we balance technology neutral goals with eventually concentrating on the technologies that work the best? But Stefan, let me ask you that 45Q tech neutral question first.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And to the question specifically, we did in the sense that we looked at the way 45Q operates now for carbon capture and storage, and the differentiation that they have in the payments for either if it's used in EOR or if it's used in permanent, if the CO2 is permanently sequestered. I think the biggest conclusion that we really found reading the literature and talking to folks and thinking through it ourselves was really the need for that transparency and confidence building of the technology, that whatever the technology it is, that it actually does what it says it does, and that is able to that is able to be counted upon by corporate off-takers, by volunteer folks who are interested in voluntary offsets and so on, and having really those robust standards and perspectives there, I think is critical. And that's also critical to building that trust that we spoke of, that Peter spoke of there, and Anu did as well. That folks need to be really confident that essentially it's doing what it says it's doing. I think to the specific question around technology neutral for example, for direct air capture, there's a few different technologies floating out there. I think is it Carbon Engineering has a process by which they use natural gas, for example, to combine both. They use the natural gas as the energy source for the direct air capture process, and then they capture the emissions from the natural gas. So it's sort of a DAC combined with DAC plus CCS model. I think that's certainly, if it's proven at scale, and I think they're building a 1 million ton a year plant currently. I think that's certainly a viable option. But again, it needs to be something that is comparable across technologies, across companies, and across borders too. I think this is going to be a really global market. We're already seeing that, for example, that a lot of demand is coming from the California low carbon fuel standard. So that can be global. Those emissions can be reduced anywhere in the globe. So that just speaks to the idea that this is going to be a really global market. 1 ton of CO2 emitted in California is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 emitted in Switzerland or anywhere else. Right.
Anu, I'd be curious to ask your thoughts on the tech neutral versus how you get the right techs, the best techs eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And so first, I wanted to just clarify a little bit when I mentioned tech neutral 45Q, what I meant by that. We're really thinking about making space for some of these smaller companies to enter the market. And so ways that we could think about doing that, and we've published a blog with these recommendations, removing or significantly reducing the minimum threshold that 45Q has right now. So I think it's 100,000 tons. That's a lot for a small company that's just demonstrating their technology. So can we make that lower and more accessible for smaller companies? We're also thinking about increasing the amount for the direct air capture piece. So to an amount that reflects the realities of DAC innovation today and what's needed to finance these projects. And then thirdly, direct pay. So a lot of smaller companies, they don't have the tax liabilities that a larger company would have. And so just structuring that in a way that is going to make it more accessible to smaller companies. But to your bigger question around balancing investment in smaller companies, but also making sure we're putting funding into those technologies that work. I think we're in still fairly early days. There's, as I mentioned earlier, tens of thousands of tons that are actually being put in the ground, and we're trying to scale up by 6-ish orders of magnitude relatively quickly. So a couple of ways that you see this balance. I believe in the federal CDR Leadership Act, there's a portion dedicated to funding small companies. So again, just keeping that space for small companies to enter the field. You can also see this in our innovation recommendations for DAC hubs. So creating space for smaller demonstrations within this larger project with the goal of reaching 1 megaton. So thinking of the 1 megaton as at the DAC hubs unit, not just a specific deployment being that large, and so adding up to 1 megaton. But I think really where you're going to see that balance show up is in creating this market for carbon removal through things like, federal CDR Leadership Act, thinking about government procurement on a large scale. Dr. Wilcox spoke to this. DOE has set that goal for the carbon negative shot at $100 per ton. That is an aggressive target. It's now really favoring companies that can't go down the cost curve and can't get their stuff to work. And so I think what we're going to end up seeing is that we've set these targets, we're creating this market, and the companies that have tech that works they're going to be the ones that are able to sell removals, high quality removals in the long run.
Thanks. We do have another question from the audience that, once again, I'll try to kind of expand. The question is for Peter, and it is, in Climeworks' opinion, is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is that it? The biggest hurdle to scale DAC quickly in the United States? For the other panelists, what are the kind of hard technology related costs and cost reductions and technology risk issues how big of a role do those play as compared to soft costs such as permitting and mutually kind of supporting infrastructure deployment? And maybe we could expand it there. But Peter, certainly would like to get your view on environmental regulations and their relation to how Climeworks sees the opportunities here in the U.S.
I guess the answer is going to be very brief. That yes, permitting is one of the larger challenges. I mean, as we look at US, I think it is to a certain extent also very site specific. We as Climeworks, we are for the most part only pursuing like direct air capturing in combination with storage in the US. So this whole question around like Class 6 permits, I think will also come into play, and depending on which state you're looking at, I think this will add an additional layer. So it certainly is. But I think we are very optimistic about a lot of movement that we're seeing in terms of how people. I think everyone has mentioned. I think regardless of who you talk to, has mentioned and is very much aware that this is a major issue, not only for us but for whoever wants to be active in that space. So I'm very optimistic that this is going to get addressed anyway. So it's a concern, but certainly not one that cannot be addressed.
I would say just to add on to that, yeah, I think DAC, the benefit of DAC is that it can be sited where you'd want to site it where there's low carbon electricity, whether that's geothermal in Iceland or nuclear electricity and heat, or cheap wind and solar, and viable storage, or some kind of off-taker that can use it in a meaningful and hopefully carbon negative way. I think for me, just to your question on the hardware costs, certainly electricity is really the big variable input, cost input for a lot of these for DAC and CCS, as well as the energy penalty that is associated with that. So improving the technology, I think there's sort of thermodynamic limits that Dr. Wilcox could probably detail in much greater detail than I. But I think an additional issue is really that pipeline, particularly if you're talking about TCS. Who's going to really pay for and build and want to operate a CO2 pipeline? We have natural gas pipeline operators in this country, oil pipeline operators. They make a lot of money by moving a valuable product from point A to point B. And it's not necessarily clear exactly to me and to others in the community how a CO2 pipeline operator will really be able to monetize. Obviously, they're a huge investment in that infrastructure to a degree that really offsets the risk there. I just want to make, I think maybe Anu can speak to this as well, is, CCS CO2 pipelines with CCS and to some degree with DAC, they're a different beast than just a natural gas pipeline. CO2 is a more, it's a more difficult a molecule to move around in a lot of ways than natural gas. And we already have kind of a lot of problems with our natural gas infrastructure today. That's not to say, of course, it's impossible, but we really want to put the time, effort, money, technology, permit or regulatory attention into making sure that these CO2 pipelines that we're building and operating are operated at the highest possible safety level, and also are sort of valuable to the communities in which they're in.
And Anu?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So coming back up to that top level question of what are the key barriers, I think permitting is a really interesting one, but we believe the way to speed up permitting is, of course, to use the tools that are available, FAST-41, things like that, but also to start with comprehensive environmental assessment. So not to kind of try to avoid it, but to do it really well up front and set best practices for these DAC deployments. So then as you go from 1 megaton to 1 gigaton, everything's kind of in place from that perspective as well. Another barrier, as has been mentioned, is infrastructure. So both on the clean energy side and the storage side, new DAC companies that are coming into the field, they're focusing on a DAC technology. They're not focusing on storage or all of the other pieces. So we kind of need that infrastructure in place. And lastly, I think a key barrier is not doing community engagement well up front. You really need to do that work at the beginning, set standards, build trust and transparency, and that's going to make the scale up much smoother in the long run. And I think DAC Hubs is just a fantastic opportunity for us to try to do all of these things well in a way that's kind of set up and currently funded. And I'm really excited to see how that goes.
Wonderful. I would love to keep asking questions such as how are we going to manage the energy needs here and whether or not we can use intermittent energy and questions like that. But I am afraid we are out of time. We have certainly learned a lot, at least I have, and at the same time, we've simply scratched the surface. So much more work to do and to learn. I want to thank again ITIF for hosting this, and thank Anu, Peter, and Stefan, and Representative Tonko and Dr. Wilcox for joining us all today. And thanks to all our audience members for joining in and asking such good questions.
Thank you all.
Thanks.